Well, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to have you all here joining our fourth session, our third online session. This session, we're going to talk about discourse studies and its relevance for supply chain management. And it's directly in connection with the special issue toward novel ways of doing qualitative research in supply chain management, where we take a developmental approach, where I'm guest editing together with Eugenia and Victoria, both present here as well. And we are really excited to have this session as part of a longer series of sessions where we invite experts to talk about specific qualitative methods that are rather novel to our fields. So, Victoria, if you could go to the next slide. Yes, so just a little highlight on what you can expect from us in the upcoming months. So today we have discourse studies as one of the sessions of the methodological expert series. We are expecting to also have a session on ethnographic studies, on action and engagement research, and visual studies, because we really hope that this inspires you on working with these type of methods, but also gives you a bit more idea about where to look for, what are the specific elements that you need to take into account when you want to start using it or when you are already using it. And then we are present in July and August during conferences. So we have a special session at the Euroma conference in Vienna, and we will be hosting a PDW at the AOM conference in Philadelphia. And well, then the deadline for the proposal is soon approaching. So in September, we will host also a Q&A session just for those of you that are submitting a proposal and have some final questions before you want to submit. So that's what you can expect. But let's go now to this first session as a methodological expert session. And we really have the idea that this might help to, well, one step further in broader learning about, well, the journey towards embracing new types of methods in the supply chain management field. And I'm really, really happy and honored that we have these three speakers on board. So we will have Eero Vaara, a professor in organizations and impact from the University of Oxford, who will talk about qualitative methods, but specifically discourse methods as part of that. Then we have Andrea Whittle with also a lot of experience in using discursive studies and methodologies. So she will also give some thoughts there and introduce a couple of specific methods as part of the discourse studies scala, so to say. And then we have Lara Schilling. She is an SCM scholar, and she has embraced or started to embrace at least the critical discourse analysis. And she will talk about, well, what did she learn about that, how to apply that to really apply it in a supply chain management setting. That all will be followed by a panel discussion. We have some questions prepared, but there might also be some room left for Q&A from you, from the audience. So if you have any questions that please feel free to post them already in the chat box. Eugenia will answer them if they are specific questions that we can answer already meanwhile. And if the questions are focused towards the speakers, we will ask them in the Q&A after we have learned from these three amazing speakers. So let's get started. I would like to invite Eero to kick off with talking about discursive perspectives. Eero, the word is to you.
Well, thank you first of all for having me, and we should all be thanking you also for this great initiative. I think we need to promote and advance qualitative research and qualitative scholarship across different areas of research in and around management research. So I think it's just a great thing that you're doing with your colleagues. and also very impressed by the fact that you have brought in several experts from different sides or different areas of qualitative research. So I think this is also really, really worthwhile, again, for promoting qualitative research and in helping people to understand the differences across these different methods. So I think this is just fantastic. So on my part, I will just briefly want to make a couple of points. And the first one is really about genres of qualitative work. And I think we can go to that slide. I apologize for self-promotion, which is happening all the time here, but I think it's best if I speak from my own experiences, both as an author who has published a lot of stuff, but also been rejected a zillion times, as well as an editor, as I've been involved with different journals. Probably the most important and the longest experience was definitely serving as one of the qualitative associate editors in AMJ a few years ago. And that leads me to this uh, advertisement of our editorial. And why am I doing this? Also, because I think in this editorial that came out already a few years ago, we really tried to make the point that, we have come so far that it's time to really appreciate the value of different qualitative perspectives. I mean, traditions, methods, and genres. And the notion of genre is something that I really always loved because that kind of captures the fact that when we're doing research, following a particular approach or paradigm, it's not only the methods like underlying the analysis or leading to the results, but it's also a question to as to how we write up the papers and present our findings and contributions. So in this editorial, we were talking about a few different types of genres. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but we were talking about the differences between variance-based case studies, process studies, engaged scholarship. Some people could call it action research, historical studies, and then discursive approaches. And we don't really need to go to the details, but basically we were also trying to just provide some general pieces of advice for people who are doing qualitative research. And now the 4 points that we have appear kind of obvious, but I think there's a lot in them in the sense that one should really know where one is coming from in terms of one onto epistemological position or the methodological tradition. And then the second point would be that all pieces of the puzzle in terms of what you're doing in your paper should somehow fit together. The third point is really encourage anyone to be authentic. Authentic, I think, in two ways. One is that one is authentic in terms of the tradition one is following. So if you're saying that, I'm doing a single case inductive study following the so-called Joya methodology, then the paper should be constructed following those examples that exist. Or if you're saying that you're doing ethnographic research, then it should be done in that way. But the other aspect of authenticity is, of course, that every project is different, and you may or we may, any one of us may in a particular project like apply these methods in different ways. And this also leads me to the fourth point, just saying that, there are great examples where people coming from different traditions have then produced amazing pieces of work. And oftentimes those really can serve as templates for us in terms of, exemplary papers to follow when we are crafting our own papers. But at the same time, I hope that no one is really feeling constrained by the examples. I think we can always do things a little bit differently. But on the whole, the main point was to say that, okay, if you're doing qualitative research, don't stop at saying I'm doing qualitative research, full stop, but take the additional step in terms of explaining what kind of qualitative research. And this is both needed, I think, but it can also be really the basis of your contribution, because oftentimes the theoretical contributions are also related to the perspectives and the methodological choices that we have. I really wanted to start with this. The second point is to go to discursive methods. And hey, this is a big challenge because we could spend I don't know how much time, like certainly months, in terms of going through different kinds of discursive approaches and their pros and cons and what they require. So I hope that you guys, anyone following this, are not like overwhelmed by this richness of methods, but more like inspired in terms of understanding that there probably is a way for me or you to, find a way of making the most out of what you have in terms of your empirical data set and analysis, what you want to do, and also, I suppose, the theoretical position. I want to, by and large, mention three types of qualitative approaches, and I know that in discursive studies, and I know that there are others who have slightly different uh, categories. And I also want to um, reproduce something that we oftentimes are talking, but I think it's just a wonderful anecdote. A very famous book on discursive or discourse studies by Potter and Wetherell includes this statement in the beginning of the book by saying that we could have two books on discourse analysis with no overlap. I think it's honestly probably an exaggeration, but it kind of tells the story that there are a variety of methods. And why? Why? Because discourse is such a big thing, not only for us in management research, but also across social sciences and the humanities. And if you go back in times, you have rhetorical analysis thriving ever since Aristotle, and then you have all kinds of new forms of qualitative and at times also quantitative discourse analysis enabled by the new tools, including AI, that enable us to do things differently from the past. But anyway, I just want to mention these three. So discourse analysis, it's kind of the overall term, but I've been, as a person, inspired by critical discourse analysis or critical discursive perspectives. This is, I think, a way of looking at the world which helps us to uncover how really many social and organizational phenomena are socially constructed. So this can be applied for specific cases or processes, or then at a more general level. So, for instance, I've been studying media texts around various kinds of phenomena, and then trying to figure out as to how for instance, controversial phenomena are looked at from very different perspectives depending on the discourse in question. So, just to give a little bit more flesh to the bones, for instance, controversial mergers and acquisitions look very different whether we take a more global capitalist perspective or whether we are looking at local concerns or nationalistic interests, or then what happens to people in terms of redundancies, for instance. The second approach or set of approaches, I should probably say, is narrative analysis. So I'm a big fan of narrative analysis as well, and I think it can be especially useful to try to better understand how people, individuals, or as social actors make sense of the world. And I've myself used this, and I'll have brief examples in a moment, to understand identity construction and how people construct their or attribute success or failure in terms of what they have encountered. So I'll have an example in entrepreneurship in a moment. But let me just mention the third approach, which I'm not really going to go into more detail, as I know there are other experts speaking about that. So whereas discursive analysis, critical discourse analysis can be seen as a very high level approach, and narratives are about individuals' stories, then conversation analysis or discursive psychology helps us to zoom in on the micro level in terms of, for instance, looking at conversations between people. So what, for instance, meetings, formal or informal, and getting really into the specifics in terms of how the language use has an impact on what happens. So those basic approaches or sets of approaches, I think, are very meaningful. But I also want to say that there are other methods. And surely there's room for mixed methods, even if the special issue is about qualitative scholarship. So I have just, well, I think we have time for the examples as well. So let's just go to the first example. So this is an example of critical discursive analysis. So we could go to the next slide now. And I have really found it useful, and I'm not the only one in the world, to use a critical discursive lens to understand legitimacy and legitimation struggles, and especially legitimation strategies. Why? Because by looking at the texts, for instance, in this example, which I realize is not fresh anymore, but it's a paper that I really enjoyed writing more than 10 years ago already. But I think it's an exemplary paper in the sense that it really pins down the process in terms of how to do a critical discourse analysis of the legitimacy struggles. In this case, the object being the Eurozone crisis. I'm not going to go into any details, but the point in this was to look at a selected data set of media material. And then I distinguished between these different underlying discourses: financial capitalism, humanism, nationalism, and what was emerging as Europeanism. But I didn't stop there. But on the basis of these discourses, then I took the extra step to see how these discourses were mobilized in this discursive strategizing in terms of different legitimation strategies. And there's a whole long list of those. I think that's the next bullet point there. And I'm not going to go into all of those, but this shows or perhaps gives some indications in terms of how this kind of analysis can become more specific in terms of detailing particular strategies or tactics through which the actors then were either legitimating, for instance, the rescue packages provided for Greece and some other countries during the Eurozone crisis, or where others were using the same or different strategies to resist what was planned. But I've used this, and of course many others as well, for many other kinds of contexts and phenomena, including, as I was telling a moment ago, mergers and acquisitions, but also shutdown decisions, as well as questions around stigma, for instance. So this is an example of a critical discursive perspective tied with legitimacy. And I could think that there are many applications, or maybe at least this could resonate with people's interest in terms of understanding questions around supply chain management in new ways. Let's go to the next example. So this is what I already mentioned in terms of narratives. So a very different kind of approach in terms of discourse studies. But narratives, they can be approached in different ways, but oftentimes it's really a useful tool if we have interviews, like people's actual accounts of what happened. They can be the interviews, that is, about their own experiences or how they see different phenomena. And this is an example of a relatively recent paper, which I co-authored with Isiar Castello and David Barbera. And it's about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who had failed, who had experienced failure, but wanted to go on to the next venture or continue as entrepreneurs. So the question was, how do these people reconstruct one's identity after failure? So this particular study kind of brings together this question of identity reconstruction, and then again, like this issue of how to deal with failure in terms of attributions, in terms of who was responsible and what was my role in this. So again, there's much more in the paper that I can summarize in about 30 seconds, but if you read the paper, you see that a key finding was that there were different narrative types that we called shielding narratives, transformational narratives or transformation narratives, and authenticity narratives that then were helpful in terms of these people being able to leave the failure behind and move on in a meaningful way. So now we have covered like discursive approaches and the narrative approaches, and yes, we could add that this is useful because then looking at those narratives informed us about how responsibility was constructed, how identity transition was enabled, and how then this was validated. But yeah, now we've covered critical discourse analysis and narrative analysis. I'm not going to the third one on my list a moment ago, which was discursive psychology or conversation analysis. But I'm just going to finish off by pointing out that we can also combine methods. And this may be a question mark whether this fits the special issue, but I just want to mention that oftentimes we can also combine methods. And this is a relatively recent paper about the discursive struggles and stigma extensions in terms of me with my colleagues, Anna Aranda, Helene Chanchu, and Jonne Hoyt. We were looking at the historical evolution of the discussions around the tobacco industry. And it's a huge empirical data set. And in many ways, this is a question of combining discourse analysis, like critical discursive analysis, with tools such as topic modeling, or more specifically, topic modeling and critical discourse analysis. Uh, and I think it turned out a meaningful way of like capturing the big data or the big patterns in terms of the discussions. If one has like really big data sets, as we had with the media material, but then combining that with a qualitative analysis of selected texts, then helped us to really understand the the stigmatization and resistance strategies that were used again in these contests or struggles in terms of uh, the tobacco side kind of defending themselves while the others were pushing for um, for acknowledgement of the health concerns and moving on to the gradual banning of tobacco in some ways. I think I need to stop here. I think my time is up, and I just hope that you got some snippets of these different kinds of approaches. Just to wrap it up, I think the first argument is that the time has come to really embrace qualitative research, but we should be clear and specific about what kind of qualitative research we're doing. The same applies for discourse analysis or discursive approaches. If we're doing this, there's the need for an additional step in terms of clarifying what kind of analysis one is doing. And I think we're in a really good position because the different traditions allow for different kinds of analysis and thereby different kinds of contributions. But I'll stop here. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for introducing us to this spread and umbrella of discursive studies. So I'm really happy to learn a bit more about that, and also the diversity in different types of discursive studies that you can then do. So that was really nice. I will stop sharing the slides for now because we have also um, some questions there. One of the questions that came up for me is that if you look at the very traditional way of doing qualitative research in the field of supply chain management, we mostly use case study type of research, and there the unit of analysis is kind of the main point that you start using to make a lot of other methodological decisions as well. And I was just wondering, is it something that you recognize for discursive studies as well, or not per se?
As answer is probably yes, and this is not an easy question. It's a little bit of a tricky question. For one, I think for starters, I think it's always a good idea to be clear about one's level of analysis and unit of analysis. That helps everyone in terms of figuring out what it is. And of course, different theories go well with certain levels of analysis and others do not. So one way of using discourse analysis, let's say rhetorical analysis that we didn't really talk about too much, or even narrative analysis would be to link those with individuals. And I think that that works oftentimes, like understanding how people promote or resist certain kinds of things, or how they reconstruct understandings as in narratives. But there's also another other way of approaching it, which is to really, if we go for a stronger version of discourse analysis, to see language as the key unit of analysis. And there too, we have then this range of like more broad level that would be discourses, as some of my examples that I quickly showed could exemplify, so that we're looking at different discourses. Or it can be more specific in terms of, for instance, discursive legitimation strategies. So those would be then the more concrete micro level, if you want, micro level elements.
Yeah.
Further complicate, there are also others who would say that, for instance, critical discourse analysis is a great methodology because it helps us to move across different levels of analysis. So there's that too. So I hope this is helpful and not confusing. But let me
Yeah.
just reiterate and re-emphasize the first point, that then one should be clear about the a unit and level of analysis.
And I can also imagine that the unit of analysis appears while you're doing the analysis, or maybe in a later stage um, um, uh, in the
Absolutely.
in doing the studies. Yes. Something else that I was wondering is, I'm not sure how straightforward this question is to answer, but what would be typical mistakes in applying discursive methods that would make you reject a paper in the review process when you would see it? Andrea was talking about, for example, triangulation. When you use the word triangulation, that would be something that would give red flags. Do you have some elements that you are looking for, or that you try to see what makes the method apply correctly or not? Could
As
you?
a person, as you can imagine, I would be open and very happy to get, if in an editor role, any paper on discourse analysis, whatever it is. So I think we can certainly and we should accommodate and embrace them. I think to me it's a question of consistency in the first place. Like, if you're arguing that I'm doing a critical discourse analysis, then it better be somehow critical discourse analysis. And I suppose what Andrea was mentioning in terms of red flags, or for instance, triangulation, there are like words or terms or things that don't go well with the underlying onto epistemological assumptions. Now, not one of those who would ask for purism or orthodoxy, but if there's like clear inconsistencies, then it feels like, okay, this person doesn't really know what they're doing. So that's one. Of course, this is not easy because in many ways, when we are, for instance, as I have, like drawn from critical discourse analysis, I've realized that we have to, of course, apply it differently depending on the project and paper in question. And oftentimes we do struggle with these questions of like how deep into the language we want to dig into. I mean, sometimes those who are in applied linguistics or what communication studies, they can afford to have more space in their papers for very detailed linguistic analysis, whereas we in management, we are somehow also dealing with managerial or organizational phenomena. So
Yeah.
we have to balance that. On the other hand, there, as we were discussion, or I was mentioning in the beginning, is also a great potential for contribution to understand these phenomena in a new light. Then I think another thing that comes to mind is that it's important that the analysis is extensive enough. This may sound like a trivial point, but sometimes maybe this goes for any other methodology, by the way, but sometimes we know ourselves where the points come from, and we may not see the importance of illustrations, for instance. But I've seen this oftentimes with discursive approaches that there are a lot of statements or telling of how it is instead of providing examples of showing how it is happening, for instance, in texts.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks a lot. I don't know if you have anything to add or something that still is undiscussed, but I think we got a really nice introduction into these methods, and I'm really grateful that you were with us in talking about this. Well, many thanks for that, and looking forward to read any other work that you probably will publish in the future on this topic. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Then I would love to hand over to Andrea to introduce us to the discourse studies methods.
That's great. Thanks, Irene. So my pleasure to be here, second time, attempting to get the recording right this time. So my name's Andrea Whittle. I'm Professor of Management and Organisation Studies at Newcastle University Business School. So my caveat I have to start with, unlike Lara's, is that my knowledge of supply chain management is, well, to say limited, I think would be a bit of an exaggeration. So as close to zero as one could imagine. I'm coming to the field as more like a layperson. But my knowledge of discourse analysis, I would like to think, is slightly higher than zero. So I'll focus very much on what I do know and love about discourse analysis in all its wonderful variety. And I'll just give some hints about how supply chain management phenomenon could be studied using it. Great, next slide, please. Okay, so in my early work, when I just finished my PhD, the approach that I used to discourse analysis was known as discursive psychology, and it's associated with the work of people who, most of them were associated with Loughborough University in the UK, people like Jonathan Potter, Margaret Wetherall, and Derek Edwards. Now, I'll start off by explaining what discursive psychology is not. It is not about the psychology of language use. It's not that, but what it is the study of how real world practices of language use in either written text or talk in interaction, how people work up or work on or work with the idea of people themselves or others having psychological processes or psychological states. So what do we mean by psychological processes and psychological states? It could be something like an attitude, something like an emotion, something like a memory, or something like an identity claim, a claim about who they are or who we are or who And what discursive psychology does is it studies how these psychological phenomena or processes are worked up or on as part of language use within the accomplishment of social actions. So many people say, well, discursive psychology is an action-oriented approach to studying discourse. And what do they mean by actions? Well, actions are anything that people do with language. So an action could be inviting someone round for dinner at your house. That's the action's called inviting. The person responding might accept or decline that invitation, in which case they're also doing social actions. Their actions are either accepting or declining. So in a nutshell, that's what discursive psychology does. And in some of my work, I found it really useful. I found it useful in analysing how people produce accounts of what they do in their day-to-day work in interviews with employees going through an experience of organisational change. And the reason I found it really helpful in my work is because I was able to look at how people carefully manage ideas about the stake or interest they have in the situation that they're describing. I've also used it not with interview data, but I've used it with naturally occurring data. In this case, it was question and answer sessions by politicians who are running a public parliamentary inquiry into the cause of the banking crisis in 2008. And in that case, I looked at how audit professionals, some of the big four audit firms, answered questions and were able to produce accounts of their own role in the global financial crisis. Great. Next slide, please. I have also then fallen in love with other approaches. So I've fallen in love also during my career to date with critical discourse analysis. And this is associated with linguists, people like Norman Fairclough or Tuan van Dijk. Now, critical discourse analysis is different. It's based on a different ontology and epistemology to discursive psychology. Discursive psychology is a strong form of social constructionism. Critical discourse analysis is different because it's founded on an approach known as critical realism, and it brings social constructionist ideas together with critical realist ideas. In the case of Fairclough, for example, Marxist ideas. So critical discourse analysis is also interested in real-world practices of language use, whether it's writing or whether it's talk and interaction. But its focus is very much on the relationship between the discourse, the words that people are using, and ideologies. Ideologies, like other approaches, are generally understood in this approach to be the sets of ideas that are circulating in a particular social group or society that then to systematically advantage one particular social group and systematically disadvantage or discriminate against or marginalize another social group. So CDA focuses very much on this relationship between how people talk or write and what that means for ideologies. And it can work in two different ways. Language use in discourse can either serve to reproduce or perhaps even reinforce and strengthen particular ideologies. Think of, for example, ideologies of feminism or ideologies of patriarchy. Or discourse can work in another way. It can be a major force of social change. So discourse can be used to problematize an existing ideology, and it can be used as a force of change to bring about questioning, unpacking, and perhaps even replacing an existing ideology. And I had a PhD student called Kate Budd, who you can see at the bottom of the slide there, who was interested in using CDA in her approach. And so together with her supervisors, me and other colleagues, we published as a result of her work. She was looking at newspaper articles about payday loan companies. And she brought critical discourse analysis together with an approach called critical metaphor analysis. That's just CDA applied to metaphors in a nutshell, to understand how and why and with what effects the newspapers were delegitimizing, questioning and problematizing this particular industry. And she theorized that as a form of moral panic about the industry. So if you've got discourse that you're working with in supply chain management that you think has a strong ideological dimension, this could be a really useful approach for you. Next slide, please. Here's a completely different approach. Now, would some people even put it in this presentation? Good question, because some people say, I don't think that ethnomethodology and conversation analysis is discourse analysis. So it depends on who you ask. Some people will say, yes, it's in that broad umbrella term that we have called discourse analysis. Some people, if you ask them, would say, a firm no. No, it's not discourse analysis. It's an approach in its own right. You can probably tell I'm more in the first camp, so I'm more happy to include this within the approaches that I use in the plethora, the smorgasbord of approaches to discourse analysis. Let's start with its origins then. Ethnomethodology. Now that was developed by an American sociologist called Harold Garfinkel. And ethnomethodology is a very confusing term. I'll spend just literally a few seconds explaining what it's not. Ethnomethodology is not a methodology. It's not like the Goya methodology. It's not like the comparative case design methodology. It's not a research methodology that we use. The word means, ethno means group or people. Method means the methods of interpretation and inferential reasoning procedures that group of people use to make sense of and produce mutually intelligible social actions as part of the unfolding sequence turn-by-turn interactions that they're engaging in with the people that they're interacting with. So ethnomethodology is the social science study of the methods that ordinary people, the people we're studying, the methods they use to get their stuff done. So conversation analysis developed by Harvey Sachs was an offshoot of ethnomethodology, and it was an attempt to take the ideas from Garfinkel and apply them to the systematic social scientific study of sequences of conversation. So conversation analysis deals with naturally occurring data. It deals with detailed tape recordings or audio recordings that enables detailed transcripts known as Jeffersonian transcripts after Gail Jefferson, who developed a particular specialized transcription notation system. And so conversation analysis takes these recordings, video or audio recordings, produces very detailed transcriptions and looks turn by turn at how sequences of interaction unfold. If I can jump to the next slide just for a second. In conversation analysis, sequence matters just as much as content. Look at the left and right of the screen, interaction 1 and 2. In terms of content, if you were to do, say, coding or style kind of grounded theory, first order coding, you would code both interactions on the left and right as identical because they contain the same content. But if you were person B in each interaction, you know that they're not the same. You shouldn't be coding them as the same interaction. So that's why sequence matters. Back to the previous slide, please. And I feel very sorry, by the way, for the person on the right, because that's clearly a way of declining a proposal for marriage, isn't it? What a horrible way to do it. So Harvey Sachs developed this approach called conversation analysis. And another offshoot from that, which I've used a lot more than CA, is called membership categorization analysis. And that's simply the study of the kinds of social identity categories that people use to describe themselves and to describe other people. So for example, I could describe myself as a woman, I could describe myself as a mother, I could describe myself as a professor. All of these are potentially plausible, usable categories I could use to describe myself. So it's focusing on the ones that are used and, importantly, the way in which that use of that particular category does things in interaction. So I found this particular approach, ethnomethodology, really useful for studying tape recordings of middle managers engaging in meetings as part of an organizational strategic change project. And I found it very useful to look at the categories that they use as part of their inferential reasoning to get decisions done, for example. I've also collaborated with Nick Llewellyn from Warwick Business School to look at a project where we brought data sets together. In this case, it's telephone calls to companies to look at how interactions during these telephone calls unfold when one party appears to be suspicious that the other person is telling a fib, telling a lie. Great, 2 slides ahead now. And finally, because I am interested in all these amazing approaches because they all offer something so brilliant, I'm also, who couldn't be, in love with narrative analysis. So narrative analysis is different to all the others because it's not interested in all forms of discourse. It's interested in the forms of discourse that take a narrative form. And by a narrative form, they mean that an account of something that's happened is placed in a temporal sequence where the sequence of events is pieced together in a meaningful way using a plot, with the people involved in the sequence of events narrated using some kind of recognizable character roles, or some people call them archetypes. So you can only do narrative analysis as a discourse analyst if your data has narratives in them. If you have a bunch of people just making statements or producing abstract claims or reeling off lists of facts and figures, it's not a narrative approach. They have to be weaving it together in a human-like story with some kind of meaningful sequence. Now, narrative analysis has different origins. It doesn't have origins like discursive psychology in social psychology. It doesn't have origins like CDA in linguistics. It has its origins mainly in literary studies. And I've used narrative analysis with a range of different data sets. So when I was interested in the public inquiries into the causes and solutions to the global financial crisis, I was looking at narrative analysis to understand the testimony that was given to bankers during that public inquiry in response to the questions that they were being asked by politicians. I've also more recently used it with a group of French collaborators who have had a data set containing interviews with people who were involved in a failed research and development joint venture. And in that particular case, we were interested in the part, typically towards the end of the interview, where people actually change the story. And we're interested in what might be triggering them to change the story and what coda or moral or message from the story might be changing as a result of that change in the story. Great, next slide, please. The thing I thought I'd end with, having gone through like a whistle-stop tour of all of the discourse approaches that I have fallen in love with over the last 25 years, I thought I'd end with something quite fundamental to all of them, that cuts across all of them. If you're analysing language use, but you're not doing it with a social constructionist paradigm, you're simply not doing discourse analysis, because that's the lowest common denominator of all of the approaches that I've just explained. Discourse analysis uses what's called a non-representational or a non-correspondence view of language. A representational correspondence view says that language merely neutrally reflects the real world out there or the real world in here inside our heads. So what social constructionist discourse analysis approaches do is reject that idea. Language is not a neutral tool for just simply reflecting the world out there or describing psychological processes in here. It's an active tool that is structuring and shaping how we view the world out there or how we talk about the world in here inside our minds. So if you've got qualitative data, let's imagine you've got some semi-structured interviews, or let's imagine that you've got some naturally occurring data like a public inquiry or a corporate social responsibility or sustainability report produced by a company. Yeah, you've got qualitative data, that's true. But you're not doing discourse analysis if you view that data as a way of accessing the world out there or the world in here inside the mind. You're doing qualitative analysis, but you're not doing discourse analysis. To do discourse analysis, you have to be interested in the way in which the language that's being used is actively constructing a particular version of things out there or things in here. And with my colleague Stephanie Reisner, we thought it'd be quite helpful, particularly if you're teaching PhD students, we thought that would be quite a helpful thing to do, explaining how, with the case of interview data, there are different what we call epistemological modes for making conclusions or claims as a researcher from your interview data. And in that paper, which is published in the British Journal of Management, we explain how the social constructionist approach is different to those other approaches. Another shameless plug for my research. Right, I think that's it. Yep, and the references are all at the end. So looking forward to hearing Lara's talk and then engaging in some discussions afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. It's really nice to see how many different approaches you have taken all under the umbrella of discourse studies. So thanks a lot for introducing us to that and doing more, like giving us a deep dive in what it means and how, when we could choose for what type of approach. Then I would like to give the hand to Lara, as she has been applying the discourse analysis approach in supply chain management field. So we're really happy to learn a bit about, okay, what does it mean? What did you run into? So Lara, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alina, for the introduction. Also, Andrea, for enlightening us on the differences of various discourse analyses. And other than Andrea, I'm not an expert in discourse analysis. However, I found it exciting when I started reading into it. So I eventually tried to see on how can it be used in the area of supply chain management, because it spoke to me very well. And yeah, I will explain a little bit on how critical discourse analysis can be used, and I will illustrate that a bit on the research I've recently published with my co-authors Mido Pornada and Stefan Seuring. So a lot of what I talk about will reflect upon that work. Yeah. But first of all, getting into why did I find it interesting and how did we come to do that? We can go to the next slide. First of all, we started with the observation that in general, there's a very positive stake on technologies being used in supply chain management. It's very solutionist power towards solving big grand challenges and easing all of the problems we face in supply chains, particularly blockchain, making our supply chains more sustainable. That was a general take for a long time. However, we also realized that this kind of view neglects a lot of other actors within the supply chain out of the focal firm, particularly small to medium-sized suppliers. They didn't really see their interests reflected in these technologies. They did care about other things and kind of didn't really see the use for that. And I experienced that also in my own research in the cocoa supply chain, where we actually could see that what from one side of the supply chain may be talked about as a very positive thing, many other actors, smallholder farmers, didn't really see that this can help to challenge and tackle their problems. So in the end, we got interested in analyzing what are actually the social problematics of language and power surrounding these, and to understand how is actually the idea that technologies solve the problems of our supply chains. How is this constructed? What are assumptions underpin it that this may be the case, and why does this idea persist? And on the next slide, we see then that we chose to use actually the academic discourse to analyze that phenomena. As Andrea already said, theoretically, any text and talk could be used to do a discourse or critical discourse analysis. The question is rather on how do you see the power of language when analyzing it. So we decided to analyze the academic discourse for two reasons. On the one hand side, the supply chain discipline is grounded or comes from a very much operations research optimization driven background. So there's a certain ideology being embedded in the discipline itself. So we found this could maybe be an interesting aspect to look into, why the academic discourse may an interesting factor here to understand on why we see technologies as a solution, particularly from the from the perspective of focal firms. And the other aspect is that the very phenomena we are looking at, the supply chain per se, is intangible. So it is by nature constructed by the words that we speak in a way. So that made it also interesting to us to look into how do actually academics talk about the impact of blockchain and supply chains. And if we go to the next slide, then we can see that, of course, while thinking about that, we also thought about different approaches to discourse analysis. We eventually then decided to go for critical discourse analysis, because here we basically have this link between how does power in language construct how we perceive reality. So it's very much this interplay between the local text, but also wider social practices in a way, which made it interesting for us to do. And also, I think something that was very important along the way to always remind is that this is really like the whole process is an analytical practice. It's not just a way to analyze a piece of text in a way, but it's really how you think about how the interplay between the words that we speak and how the world is seen, how they come about in a way. And now to go back to the very aspect of critical discourse analysis, that you have basically different levels of analysis and the interplay between the text and the wider social practices. We basically in our research broke this down into certain elements, analytical elements, you could say. And this is what we show on the next slide. And here I will just illustrate a little bit on what are certain aspects we looked at and the interplay between them, without really going very deep into the very context that we did the analysis in. And if we click one further, we see in how we first of all zoomed in on the text level. So the text level, like the academic text, that's our corpus of text we're looking at. And then first of all, we try to understand, okay, how are basically sentences constructed? How are arguments built? What is the sequence of words, and how are basically the logics constructed within a sentence? And also we were interested in how do actually authors talk about the subjects they discuss. Is it neutral? Is it more, have they more a skeptic tone in it, or is it more positive? Where we saw that we had very much very positive sentiments in these texts, particularly in the abstracts of the texts, which convey a lot of meaning to others. In the second step, then, we looked a little bit deeper, and here we can go to the next slide already. What is actually the line of argumentation that is conveyed by putting these sentences together that we analyzed in the first step, in particular also what are the arguments built when authors refer to other texts. So here we looked into the intertextuality, and in order to understand how does language create power in the way the one author made kind of build upon the argument of someone else. Sometimes also the arguments change or get maybe kind of a little bit more provocative along the way. So that's something interesting to see how this develops from the text level. And here we basically identified three dominant discourses around the use of blockchain and supply chains. It's around efficiency, safety, and sustainability. And here we could trace back on what are the texts that most authors draw upon when they build these arguments. But also we saw that these effects on efficiency, safety, and sustainability build on a humanist understanding of power. And it very much builds on a centralized perspective on the supply chain, and that is power is inherent to certain actors within the supply chain, which brings us back to the ideology embedded within the constructs that are, or in the arguments that are being built. And in the next slide, we can see then how we try to understand. So if this is the case, one might but that these arguments basically overlook a lot of other actors in the supply chain, that they are silenced in these discourses, and the way we reframe the use of these technologies. Why does it persist like that? Why is there no challenging discourse emerging that maybe can counteract this? And here we found interesting phenomena on how these effects on efficiency, safety, and sustainability are legitimized. Legitimized by things that are not being questioned in a way, because they draw upon either exact knowledge claims, maybe institutional authority, so we take it for granted that this is something good, so we're not questioning it. Or also moral value systems we all believe in, or a majority may believe in, and therefore it doesn't get questioned. So this kind of can explain a bit why discourses, or some of the discourses, persist over time and are not challenged in a way. Which doesn't mean it may forever continue like this, but this is for the time sequence we looked at it. And then that is basically mainly a bit of a glimpse on how we try to bring basically the interplay between the very text and how it then stabilizes and interplays with societal phenomena together. However, while doing that, of course, we faced a lot of challenges in our own way of thinking, but also in review processes. And I'm going to reflect on that in the next slide. Here we see basically, I think, one of the things I found very important for me to get clear. In any way, when we analyze in any kind of discipline, but I think particularly in supply chain management, it's very important to have a clear picture on the unit of analysis we are looking at when we analyze the text and the talk we're looking at in CDA. And that became even more difficult if doing a critical Kirchhoff analysis that also looks at different levels of analysis. So we have the text level, the discursive level, the societal level. And then basically looking into this unit of analysis at the different levels. But then we have also to think about, okay, but what is then the unit of observation where we can analyze our unit of analysis on these different levels? So the unit of observation is basically the corpus of text we are looking at, and how to best identify what is the relevant corpus of text that is shaping the discourse. Where can we basically see the constructive power of language and untackle it? So what are the right sources to look at? That was, I think, a big challenge along the way. And however, I think that was something more on in a procedural way that I think I found difficult. But I think the most difficult part that comes to the last slide and very well aligns with what also Andrea previously said, is to, throughout the whole process, see the language or be aware of the constructive effects of language, which means that it's not just something that the words that we speak, they mirror what we think or what reality is like if we would look in a mirror, but it's more that the words that we speak or the text that we read or whatever, that this kind of constructs reality. And this is also where it shows the interplay between the constructive nature of language and then how it affects also us in society, how we see the world, and also how it can support or challenge ideologies. And I think this is something which is very new in our supply chain management discipline. And I think this is for reviewers, but also for researchers themselves doing critical discourse analysis or doing discourse analysis, a very challenging task, because it's not just something you apply in the analysis, because if it becomes just an analytic, like just an add-on in an analysis, then it basically creates a contradiction, because if you treat part of the argument as if the text basically reflects what reality is, and the other part you treat it as constructionist, then it kind of creates a little bit of tensions. And I think this is something to really consider along the research process, even though I think it's also difficult. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lara. So thank you for taking us along in this process that you have taken to try and adopt critical discourse analysis. Really insightful. Thank you for that.